You're listening to The Big Lift, the podcast of Web Trends Optimize, the CRO solution that enables marketers and developers to maximize the ROI on their digital properties. Web Trends Optimize is a powerful, feature-rich and easy-to-use solution, all delivered within a fixed-price contract with no additional cost for increased functionality ever. During these podcasts, we meet some of the key influencers within the marketing and conversion world to understand their roles and examine their challenges. Today I'm in conversation with Steph, LePevost and Harriet Swan from Conversion about how to ensure that the research that is done prior to planning an experiment or test will deliver the potential outcome. We discuss how Conversion's simple approach to planning the research is as important, or some might say even more important, than the experiment itself. Good morning, Harriet, and welcome from Vancouver, and good afternoon, Steph, who's joining us from Guernsey, so definitely a bit of an international flavour to this month's podcast. One of the things that we've always discussed on these sessions is how challenging it is for the people to be able to do experimentation. I'll use that word probably as best because it is quite complicated. And I think I've come up with an idea that perhaps might work for an introduction to this, which is trying to optimise a client's website is often seen as quite complicated and based on many and varied factors. But more often it's based on research. Now, I believe you have formulated a simplified question-led methodology which helps to define what to research, which in turn supports how you approach your experiments. So, Harriet, you might be the best person to ask this in the first instance. Where does that approach start?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first step is really to understand and unpack all the questions that you're looking to answer. And I think often it starts with kind of someone throws out a question and it almost, the role of the researcher starts there, really trying to kind of ask questions to understand what's really the core beneath that, which we're really trying to answer. So the process really starts with unpacking that and really trying to do almost like a big brain dump of all the questions that we have. And those questions can come from different places. So can come from kind of our clients and either our stakeholders directly or other people in their organisation. We also, I think, because we work closely with our clients, have a real understanding of the business and their roadmap and what they're trying to achieve. So also kind of come prepared with some of the key questions that we really want to understand about the users that are going to help inform some of the testing or kind of design updates that we really might want to do.
Is that something that happens frequently, or is it a quarterly thing, or is it something you do at the beginning of the year and these are our hopes and aspirations, or how does it work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we always try or we'd like to work at least kind of a few months ahead. So with most of our clients, we have either quarterly or potentially biannually kind of planning sessions where we're really trying to understand, what are they as a business trying to achieve? And then from that, we'll build a roadmap of activities that we have to kind of best achieve them. And that will be a mixture of A/B testing, experiments, as well as research activities. And we'll kind of plan the sequence of them based on, when we know they're wanting to, for example, launch certain pages or kind of launch certain products. Realistically, we kind of set up that plan, but it is something we'll be, checking in on probably on kind of a monthly or even bi-weekly basis. As we all know, things kind of shift. So we'll have a long-term vision to really make sure that our program's aligned with their business objectives, but then it is something we're kind of checking in on fairly regularly to kind of course correct or, add other questions that might not have come up in advance.
Does that, Stephanie, you might want to answer this, does that hinder spontaneity? Because lots of companies like to be spontaneous about how they deal with their experimentation and their customer journeys. This is quite planned by the sounds of it. How do you build in that kind of spontaneity into those?
It's a good question. So as Harriet says, we do plan as much as possible, so we'll have a list of research questions that we're looking to approach throughout the experimentation program, and those could be answered with a variety of methods, including testing itself, as a research method. In terms of spontaneity, we're always sort of agile in our approach, so we work in monthly sprints, and what we do during that time is approach the client and make sure that they're happy with the research questions, the experiments that we're laying out to answer those, and the problem spaces we're working on. And if the client needs to pivot, then we absolutely will help with that. Obviously, we'll talk about, what that will mean for the overarching strategy, maybe the downsides, the upsides, and together we can make that decision and make sure that we're facilitating, answering those bigger questions that maybe come up a bit more ad hoc.
Now, I'm assuming that you gather a whole load of people into a different room, or have you already thought your own ideas and going into a room with kind of where we think this is going to work, or is it a mixture of both?
It's a mixture of both, to be honest. Usually what we'll do is start with the questions. We'll then map those questions to the correct research. And then we usually do like a playback of that research to our clients. From there, together, we ideate based on the barriers that we've seen, how we might solve those with experimentation, or whether there's more research to be done in that space. But it really depends, like client to client, how involved they are, how much spare time they have, because a lot of people will use an experimentation agency because they don't have the hours to be spending on testing, but they know it's important. So it really just depends how much time they have, how involved they want to be.
And where do you go from there once you've all sat in a room and come out with a mammoth list of things to do?
It moves into our prioritization model. So when we're talking about research, that's prioritized like up front. So before we've even sort of come up with concepts, when we're talking about the research questions, they're prioritized by impact and ease. So impact being like how impactful, how big is this question, and how important is it to answer. The ease is how easy it is to answer. So if it's using a research method like user testing that you're really familiar with and you have access to a tool, it's pretty easy to answer. If it's something much more advanced that you haven't really done that much, you don't have a tool for, then the ease is going to be harder. But when it comes to concepts, there's an entirely kind of different prioritization model that we use called SCORE, but it mainly centers around sort of the pie and using our previous experiments in our database to understand if that experiment's going to perform well as well.
Does that kind of process, I'm talking about the prioritization, change with regard to somebody who you're doing experimentation for the first time versus somebody who's much more mature in doing it?
Sometimes, I guess, is the answer. So the much more mature ones need a more, I guess, like complex prioritization like we have with SCORE to ensure that we're balancing the experiments that we're choosing. So you need to make sure you're choosing, different build size, different risks, to make sure that you're going to be hitting those wins and getting those uplifts that the client needs to see. Whereas those that are just starting out, I hate the word, but there is low-hanging fruit. So there's those, those tests that are really quite obvious once you see the research, where particularly like, for example, a subscription brand, users often complain that they just don't understand when they're going to get charged, how they cancel, all of those things. So an experiment surrounding that would be classed as sort of low-hanging fruit. It's research informed, but it's a general trend we see amongst subscription companies. And that prioritization can be a lot more rapid to yield results quickly, to show people the value of experimentation.
This is a question I always ask when somebody mentions priority, especially when they've got one or two different priorities. Which priority takes priority?
Well, it depends which one gets kind of scored the highest if you're looking at it objectively. However, it kind of also depends like which one's going to make the most impact for the client on their problem spaces. So our priority model is very good at taking into account a lot of data points. What it doesn't take into account is the client relationship. So if a client is coming to you and saying, we have a really big problem with returns, we really need to pivot our focus onto this, then you may sort of ignore that score a little bit, and look at different concepts to help address that problem.
So you're saying there's some fluidity in how you actually implement this process that you've got, because obviously we don't all fit into the right boxes at the right time. We need to be able to duck and dive a little bit to be able to make sure we're doing things to the best of our abilities anyway.
Yeah, exactly that.
So where do you go from being able to get through the prioritization of what needs to be done?
I think I can maybe jump in here. I think the next step is then, once we've decided what's the priority and what's kind of the key question or business decision we're looking to inform, then it's really deciding on what's going to be the most valuable or relevant method to answer that, what kind of most valuable research method. So the next step is then really kind of deciding on that, and I think there's different factors that go in there. I think as long as we're really clear and we've spent the time understanding the research objectives and the action we're really wanting to take from that research, often kind of the methodology is quite clear from that. So there's, I guess, different ways that we think about it, different kind of spectrums. So, you might want to use a quant methodology if you're really looking to kind of answer, how many people think or do something. If you're really looking to understand kind of deeper ways that people think about things and really delve into human psychology, you're going to want to take a much more kind of qualitative methodology. And then another kind of way we think about it is, are we trying to really understand behaviors? Are we trying to kind of see how people can get through a checkout flow, for example, and, successive tasks, because a certain methodology would work best there? Or is it more about kind of getting more deep user feedback on kind of their reaction to content, for example?
So it's interesting, looking at both your backgrounds, one of you did a degree in anthropology and the other one's done a mini degree in psychology. How much do you think that your views of the world influence what's taking place in this kind of process that's there? Are you thinking more about the psychological approach, the impact upon how things are working, or is it really down to what works best? Either of you can answer.
I definitely think the psychology side of things plays into experimentation. The big thing for me is making sure that morally it's okay. So we all have psychological biases. Even people who are aware of them can be affected by them, and experimenters often will expose those biases and push down on them. And you always have to ask yourself, at what point is this morally not okay? So I think that psychology side of things is always on my mind, and certainly a lot of the consultants at Conversion have degrees in psychology as well. So it tends to be something we see throughout the field, that's always playing a part to understand the user, and then also to understand sort of the power that you do yield.
Yeah, because I've talked to a lot of people who have a similar view on psychology. My late wife was a psychologist, so I kind of understand a little bit about where you're coming in from. But experimentation is all kind of numbers as well, isn't it? It's data on one side, and then it's this softer approach to the psychological viewpoint of how people behave. When you're going to be able to determine what the best methods of your research is going to be, how much weight does each one of those have, or does it not have any weight at all?
Again, I guess it depends.
The answer's always going to be depends, I think, in these conversations.
Yeah, exactly. So when we map out our research questions, we'll look at what methodology is most appropriate to answer those. And that could well mean that there's more of a psychological background into that methodology. So Harriet, for example, has done limbic mapping, and there's a product that we have called Neurolabs, which looks at skin galvanization and rapid eye response to how you're actually perceiving the website rather than what you're sort of saying you're perceiving, which I guess can often be different. So we know that in user tests, people will say, oh, this website's lovely, no issues, this looks great. But there really are issues. So it's about reading between the lines and kind of seeing that behavior. So yeah, it just depends on the methodology that you're choosing.
I'm intrigued that you actually have the ability to be able to monitor what I think you said was skin tone and things like that, and the reaction of people that are viewing a particular website, to be able to see if they, presumably if they change colour, like going red or something like that, they might be a bit embarrassed. But I would think that that's probably a pretty fascinating type of research there in its own self, to be able to determine what impact that you're having on somebody, rather than just being able to look at it nonchalantly and saying, okay, yeah, the data figures have gone up or they've gone down, but actually watching somebody looking at your website or looking at your client's website and seeing them react to that. That must be fascinating to be able to do that. But that might be a good discussion that we have somewhere along the line. Going back a little bit to the method of research and how you do that research. In the meetings that I've always sat in all of my career, there's always one person, which is the senior most person, has an opinion. And that opinion is often the one that's being influenced to take the strongest point. Do you find that still in what you do? And how do you deal with somebody who's got a very strong opinion to do it one way?
Yeah, I would say that definitely resonates. I think that's definitely something that does, of course, happen. I think that's kind of almost where I think the space for doing user research or customer research can be really valuable, because it almost takes away the opinion and kind of you're saying, oh, well, that might be true, but why don't we kind of talk to actual kind of users and see? So I think that's where it's kind of really important to almost bring that in, and rather than, you saying it or kind of if it comes from people's customers or users. And I think we've all been there where, if people see like a testimonial or a quote, that can be so powerful and almost swaying if there is kind of someone with a very, very strong opinion.
You've got this far, you've kind of done your idea of what research you're going to do, but planning the research itself must be quite challenging as well, because you have got so many different various methods to be able to do that, as you say, surveys, usability testing, 5-second tests, etc. Does that take a long time, or is it something that's usually done within a fixed period of time?
I would say in terms of kind of planning in the sense of almost like designing the research, I think, again, I know we keep saying it depends, but I would say, of course, it depends on, the methodology and what kind of the question is.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you allocate a time for these things to take place? So, for instance, if you look at usability testing, we're going to do that for 2 weeks or a week or 10 days or whatever. Do you actually put time frames around these kind of relevant research areas?
Yes, we do. So I'd say something like usability testing is something that can typically be conducted pretty quickly. So in, let's say, kind of a week or so, again, depending on, if it's a really hard to reach audience, it might be a little bit more difficult. And then something that's maybe a lot more motivational might take, a few weeks. Some research can take kind of several months. So we do know roughly how long things will take. And then I think that's also something that really plays into the planning, in the sense of if we know, we need a decision in the next couple of weeks, that might be something, taken into account of, well, which methodologies are, of course, giving us the insights we need, but then balancing that with giving them at a time where we can actually use them and kind of drive action from them.
So going back to the point we said about being reactive in certain instances, being, having the ability to be flexible, you've got that you can presumably elongate or shrink those timeframes to be able to do it to fit in. Do you think that affects the quality of the research?
I think we're always trying, there's always that balance of speed and quality. And of course, we always want to make sure we're doing high quality research. But I think we also need to be pragmatic and ensure that the research can give insights in a manner that we can kind of drive action. And I think our approach is around continually, testing, learning, iterating, and kind of better to do more frequent, I guess, research and testing to be able to kind of constantly be improving and optimizing than do kind of, one big research study that then takes a while to get the insights and they might not be kind of relevant.
So in your planning of research, we talked a little bit earlier about one being impact and the other one being ease. Of those two, which one would you attack in your research first? Would it be ease because it's easier to do, or is it the one that creates the biggest impact, the one you'd go for first?
So ease and impact are both scored by us, like on a value of 1 to 10. So that both are attributed to the question, and then that helps us prioritise the question itself and whether that should be answered first. So if impact scored, a 5 for question A, but a 4 for question B, and ease was, a 5 for question A and a 3 for question B, suddenly question A becomes the priority. So I guess that's how we approach it. So they're kind of scored separately, and then that helps us prioritise the right question rather than prioritise impact or ease.
In our discussion prior to this, you said that there's a lot of things to go into this part of planning the research. We've got a little bit of time. Perhaps you could just go through how you plan that research, if you can. Say, just to give me a broad brushstroke of what it looks like on once you've all come out of the room and agreed what you're going to do. Planning the research, is that a team effort that you plan it all together, or somebody take control and say, okay, I'm going to write the research plan for this, and then everybody else follows?
Yeah, so generally the consultant will kind of take the reins on that one, and what we'll produce is a document that shows what questions we're going to answer, what methodology we're going to be using and why, and how many participants there will be, what those participants will be doing for that methodology. So if it's user testing, the client will see a script that they're going to follow. And then once that's sort of all produced, then we'll set up the actual research. So again, if it was user testing, for example, I myself quite often use usertesting.com. So I'll input the script onto there. I'll make sure it's all set up correctly. I'll test the setup to make sure that I can actually make my way through it. Nothing worse than putting a user test live and finding your users can't complete it.
Yeah.
And then once the client gives the go ahead, we'll just go live with that research. It will collect as quickly as user testing can recruit those participants. And then we go and review those videos and document what we find through our insights and observations methodology.
Now, just to reiterate, this is all the kind of research element before you actually do any of the experimentation process. Am I correct in that?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So every experiment we run will be informed by research of some kind. So whether that's anything from a heuristic or competitor analysis to, user testing, surveys, even past A/B tests that we might have run, everything should be informed by research because we know that has a higher win rate.
Yeah, just to jump in there, I think we do also, in addition to that, so we do also sometimes do research at the same time as A/B tests. So if we're looking to kind of bring the kind of behavioural and the attitudinal together, we do sometimes do research on, the control and the variant, or even if we run an A/B test and it's maybe a surprising result, we might then also follow it up by research. So it's almost this kind of sequence of each informing each other.
Now, I may actually be diving in a little bit into the weeds here, but one of the things that I find has some of the biggest impact is emotion in a website, of being able to get people on your side. And I use the analogy of the old shopkeeper that would ask lots of questions of his customers as he walked in. This is pre-supermarket days, so you're probably all far too young to remember that. But when the corner shop guy would be... Mrs. Smith would walk in, he'd be having a chat with Mrs. Smith and saying, "Oh, how is it? How's your kids?" and all that sort of thing, which is basically the research. When they should be telling him about what was going on, he'd say, "Oh, how was that piece of lamb you had last week?" And she'd say, "Oh, it was lovely. I did it like this, or it was wonderful, or wasn't quite so good." Again, that's user research. And then they would say, "Oh, that's really good. What can you recommend?" And the guy would say, "Oh, well, I've got this lovely piece of beef," or whatever it might be, whether it's beef or whether it's vegetables, whatever it might be. And that would be kind of, if you like, the payoff. That kind of emotion and that association to people, I feel, is very, very strong. And I think more and more people are trying to be able to get to that element of being able to have, if you like, an understanding of them and the brand together. Does that ever come into your research, how emotive these things are?
Yes, definitely. And I would say there's certain types of research we'll do when we're really trying to tap into that and understand that kind of deeper emotion. So there's, certain methodologies, for example, kind of like first impression testing, and you're getting people to kind of call out, the words they're feeling, or I think Steph mentioned limbic mapping as well. I think often to really tap into that, we'll want to use a very kind of unstructured, it would have to be a moderated type of conversation where, as you say, you're really being much more led by the user. So really kind of making sure you're not, bringing in your bias or kind of leading them in any direction, and really being able to kind of have certain questioning techniques to really get at that kind of deeper emotional level.
So, okay, you've kind of got to your point where you've done all these wonderful things, you've done your research, you've now being able to say, okay, how do we move forward? How much does that research drive what physically takes place over the next coming weeks and months?
It drives it a lot from a perspective of where we focus our efforts. So when I've delved into the research, written down everything I've learned from it, what I do is categorise what we've learned. So the insights, so the overall learning, the observations, what actually happened, so maybe the facts or what a user has said. I'll categorize those by whether they're a barrier to the user or whether they're a motivator or whether they feel neutral about it. And then I'll also use our lever framework, which essentially allows us to add a theme to that insight. So the 5 master levers would be cost, usability, motivation, trust, and
comprehension.
Thank you. And I categorize them like that. So then I immediately can see if I have 100 insights and 50% of them are comprehension and 40% of those are barriers, there's a massive issue there. And that's where I should then focus my experimentation efforts. Or you might find that actually trust has loads of motivation around it. So you might want to double down on that and actually look at where are the reviews? Could we pull those into different areas of the website? Is there a really good authority of this brand? Should we be looking at recommendations? That sort of thing. So the questions directly give you research, and that research essentially, the answers to your questions are prioritized by that kind of tagging methodology that I just explained.
Yeah, because it does seem like that you could end up with a whole load or a whole myriad of different things which you say, oh, we've got this user tested did that, the surveys did that, we've got that, how do we pull that all together? That must be quite a thing to be able to draw it in together and say, okay, how do we move forward with this particular, whether it's a campaign or whether it's an experiment? Is that then a cumulative approach back to the team who throw all those kind of things into the mix at the very beginning? Or is it something that you as consultants do and then take it forward to the client?
Yeah, so we'll do that approach, that sort of lever mapping approach and the motivations and barriers, and present back to the team like why we would focus on those problem spaces, and then show them the experiments that would help answer like those problems. It could be more of a joint effort where we might ideate together on that problem space and show them, the insights, and then ideate off the back of that. But again, it comes down to how involved that client really wants to be.
Do you think there's a difference in B2B versus B2C, or even direct to consumer? Is it something that people have strong opinions about, or does it work? This methodology work for everyone?
I think it works for everyone. I think it works in the B2B or the B2C space. Obviously, the research might be a bit different, kind of depending on the specific audience you're going for. But I think the general kind of approach, I'd say, holds true. But yeah, interested in what you're about to say, Steph.
No, I was going to agree. Yeah, I think it definitely holds true in terms of you can always use that same prioritization model for your questions. You always use the same sort of approach to this is where your problem spaces lie in those master lever spaces, and this is where their barriers or motivations, because the research itself will give you different answers, yes, but the way that you can categorize those would be the same.
You mentioned a couple of minutes ago, maybe 10 minutes or so, a couple of research methodologies, one being limbic and the other one being benchmarking. We've got a little bit of time here. Perhaps you might want to be able to just elucidate a little on what limbic is, and I'll get the other one to talk about benchmarking.
Yeah, sure. Limbic is essentially kind of a way of mapping emotional associations. So I think to your kind of question earlier, John, it's a great methodology to really understand that emotional kind of side of people and users, and there's kind of a very structured way of doing so. So it's typically something that we use in very generative exploratory research where, it might be that it's informing a website experience, but often we're having kind of really deep conversations with users and being very user-led, really trying to understand their kind of deeper motivations and way that they think about things, which I think is kind of a type of research that maybe isn't done enough but can be kind of the most valuable, because if you can really unlock some of those emotional kind of needs, that's something that kind of can really be a big opportunity that you can then kind of apply across your website or even kind of outside of that as well.
Do you think that actually needs some sort of trained eye or trained ear from a psychological perspective, somebody who's gone through a psychological course or is a psychologist?
I think it does require, it's definitely a more kind of complex type of research to do. And I think having an understanding of human psychology is important. I think what's really important as well is kind of the skill of the researcher and getting that depth and kind of asking the right questions, real active listening. And then I think kind of lateral thinking as well, because I think it's not just hearing kind of what people say, but being able to kind of understand kind of underneath that what they mean and kind of, so definitely a more, I guess, skilled type of research than some of the other ones that we've talked about.
And what about benchmarking?
Yeah, so benchmarking I think is another really valuable type of research, and is, I think, a really good way of showcasing the impact that research can have in an organisation. I think it can be hard to get buy-in and sometimes to kind of link some types of research, particularly the more kind of qualitative methodologies, with business impact and ROI. So I think being able to do benchmarking, and what I mean by that is essentially researching your website and then doing the same type of research over time, or benchmarking your research against competitors. So it typically is a very kind of structured approach where you have, a set of tasks, ratings, that then allow it to be compared. And that can be a really valuable way for researchers to kind of connect the work that they're doing with the impact it's then having on the business.
Is benchmarking around any specific set of questions that you would throw out there to get responses for? And if so, are they the same set of questions that you use over that longer period of time?
You'd want to use the same type of questions pretty much for that client, but between kind of clients or across different types of benchmarking, that set of questions could be different. So with any type of research, you're going to kind of tailor your questions for what those objectives and that experience is. But once you've kind of set those up, to be able to fairly and accurately benchmark, you'd want those same set of questions, whether it's comparing to competitors or whether it's then, a year later doing the same study to see how the needle has kind of moved over time.
I'm assuming a lot of what we've talked about today is part of the unique selling points of conversion.com. Do you have anything on your website that our listeners could actually point to and gain a little bit more information if they have been stimulated by this?
Yeah, definitely. So I mentioned the levers framework, and that is well worth reading up on, about how we apply that and why it's useful in experimentation. And then outside of that, if you're interested in the benchmarking stuff that Harriet mentioned, we have a few benchmarking studies on there. There's particularly one done recently around subscription brands. So for those listening that are a subscription brand, that may well be worth checking out. But other than that, if you have questions about what we've spoken about today, then feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn and we'll be happy to help.
Steph, Harriet, thank you very much for your time. It's obviously something which is continually changing over the period of time that I've certainly been in this industry, and it's always good to be able to get companies' view on how they actually do their experimentation and their research. So thank you very much for affording me such a good time to be able to make this work.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been really enjoyable.